gates were closed. They were always closed at this hour. 2 hours before dawn, the black iron sealed against the winter dark, the fortress walls rising 40 feet into a sky that offered no stars and no warmth, and nothing at all except the steady, indifferent fall of snow. Sera had been standing in front of those gates for 11 minutes. She knew because she had counted. It was a habit she'd kept through 9 days of walking, counting steps, counting hours, counting the things she still had and the things she did not. She still had her boots, though the left one had split at the heel on day 4, and she'd wrapped it with a strip torn from her underskirt. She still had the copies, sewn into the lining of her travel cloak with her own needle and thread the night before the exile, her fingers shaking and precise at the same time. She still had her name, though the Ironmere pack had done its best to make that worthless.
State your business.
She did not have food. She had not had food in 2 days. The small window set into the iron gate opened. A guard's face appeared in the gap, middle-aged, bored, his expression already forming its refusal before she had said a word. "Gates open at 6th bell," he said. "Come back then." "I need to speak with someone now," Sera said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. 9 days in the snow had burned away most things, but her voice, apparently, was not one of them. "Come back at 6th bell." "I've been walking for 9 days, she said.
5, 6, 7,
"I came
8,
from
9,
Ironmere.
10, 11, 12,
I have
13,
information
14,
about
15.
treaty violations that your Alpha King will want to hear before the Border Council meets in 3 weeks. The guard stared at her. "My name is Sera Coldwell," she said. "I was the pack record keeper's daughter. I was exiled 6 days ago on false charges of treason. The charges were fabricated to prevent me from delivering evidence that Lord Vennick of Ironmere has been selling stolen territory maps to the Blackthorn pack for 6 years.
Heave.
The maps
Pull.
cover 40 miles of the
Steady.
King's northern border.
They're here.
I have copies of 7 of them, along with the original transaction records bearing Lord Vennick's seal." The guard said nothing. "I know it's before dawn," Sera said. "I know I look like exactly what I am. A woman who has been walking in snow for 9 days with nothing.
Verace.
I know that is not the presentation one hopes to make. I'm asking you to wake someone, anyone. Tell them what I just told you. If they send me away, I will go." The window
You
closed.
seek entry?
The snow fell.
Who are you?
She stood.
I seek
The cold had
shelter.
long since moved past the point of being painful. It was simply part of her now, the way the weight of the cloak was part of her, and the ache in her left heel was part of her. She had stopped arguing with any of it somewhere around day 6. She counted to 300, then to 500. The small window did not open again. The gate did. Both panels, swinging inward on iron hinges, the sound of them enormous in the silent pre-dawn courtyard beyond. A guard stood on each side. Between them, a man in a night watch cloak holding a torch that lit his face from below. "Coldwell," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said.
1,
"Come in out of the
2,
snow,"
3,
he said.
4, 5, 6,
"Someone will
7,
want to
8,
speak with
9,
you."
10, 11, 12, 13,
She walked
14,
through the gates.
15.
She did not look back at the road behind her. The 9 days of it, the cold of it, the particular quality of alone it had contained. She was done with all of that now, one way or another. The gates swung closed behind her. She had not always been a traitor. That is the thing about exile. It makes the before feel very far away, as if the person who existed before the verdict was someone else entirely. A stranger who had lived a small and careful life in the pack records room, surrounded by ledgers and ink, and the particular silence of a room where no one bothered you because the work was considered too tedious to interrupt. Her father had taught her to read the records when she was 7. Most pack daughters were not taught. Her father was of the opinion that this was a waste. He had no sons, and the records room would not run itself, and Sera had a precision with numbers and the memory for detail that he said was wasted on embroidery. She had worked beside him until she was 19. When he died, quietly, in the winter, a chest sickness that took him in 3 weeks, she had simply continued. The Pack's alpha at the time had not objected. She was invisible and useful. 2 qualities that, she had learned, made most powerful people comfortable. Lord Vennick had become alpha 2 years after her father's death. He was not a bad man, in the way that men who do bad things for understandable reasons are not entirely bad. He wanted the Pack to be stronger than it was. He wanted resources the Pack did not have. The northern border territories that Ironmere controlled were rich in timber and waterways, and several neighboring Packs, including the Blackthorn, who had money and ambition, and no territory worth having, were willing to pay handsomely for the maps that detailed them. The problem was that the northern territories did not belong to Vennick to sell. They were held in trust, under a treaty with the Alpha King's court. Borders agreed and sealed 3 generations ago, and they could not be transferred, sold, or granted without the King's seal. Vennick had been doing it anyway, quietly, for 6 years, alternative the transaction dates and the records, to make each sale look like a minor administrative adjustment. Small enough to overlook, consistent enough, if you read 7 years of records in sequence and knew what you were looking for, to be undeniable. Sera had not been looking for it. She had been doing a routine audit of the winter land assessments when she found the first discrepancy. A map reference that did not match the territorial ledger entry above it by 3 degrees. Small enough to be a copying error. She had checked the original, then the transaction record, then the one before it, and the one before that. By the time she understood what she was looking at, she had been in the records room for 4 hours past her usual evening departure. She had sat very still for a long time. Then she had done what her father had trained her to do. She had verified. All 7 transactions, all 7 maps. The original seals, the altered dates, the Blackthorn correspondence filed under a ledger marked agricultural surplus. She had been meticulous and thorough, and she had told no one, because she had not yet decided what to do, and the one thing her father had always said was, "Do not speak until you know what you are going to say." She had stayed late the next night to copy the records. She had not known that Vennick had started having the records room watched 3 months earlier. A junior clerk, ambitious and loyal, who had noticed the same discrepancy she had and brought it to the Alpha before Sera had found it herself. Vennick had been waiting for someone to find it. He had simply not expected it to be her. They came for her at midnight. 6 Pack enforcers, an elder to read the verdict, a charge of espionage, selling Pack information to enemy territories, a finding of guilt, a sentence of exile, to be executed within 12 hours or commuted to death. She had not argued. She had not cried. She had stood in the great hall in her records room clothes, with ink still on her fingers, and listened to the verdict with her face as still as she could make it, calculating. The copies were already sewn into the lining of her travel cloak. She had done it 2 weeks earlier, when she had first understood what she had found. As a precaution, she had not let herself fully name. She had left Ironmere before dawn. 9 days later, she had walked through a pair of iron gates in the dark and stood in a cold stone courtyard with nowhere left to go except forward. They put her in a room off the guardhouse. It was small and cold and had no window. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a candle stub in an iron holder. 2 guards stood outside the closed door. Someone brought her water and a rough wool blanket and a piece of bread that was 2 days old and the best thing she had eaten since she had left the Ironmere border. She sat at the table. She did not sleep. She had not slept well in 9 days, and she understood that this room was not a safe place to let her guard down regardless. She was inside a fortress she did not know, dependent on the goodwill of people she had never met, with evidence that powerful men wanted destroyed. Sleep was not available to her yet. She ate the bread very slowly. She drank the water, She sat with her hands flat on the table and waited. At dawn, she knew it was dawn by the change in quality of the silence, the small sounds of a large building waking. The door opened. The man who entered was perhaps 50, lean and sharp-faced with gray at his temples, and the careful carriage of someone who had spent a long time managing things more difficult than she was. He set a second candle on the table, sat across from her, and looked at her with the particular assessing stillness of someone who had heard many stories and found most of them lacking. "Harwick," he said, "senior advisor to the Alpha King." He did not extend his hand. "You are Sera Coldwell." "Yes." "You were exiled from Ironmere 6 days ago." 9 days ago, I walked." He looked at her. 9 days. "The eastern road through the Gelmark Pass," she said. "The low route. There was snow on the high pass." Something in his expression shifted very slightly. Not warmth exactly, more like an upgrading of category. "Tell me what you have," he said. She told him. She had rehearsed it in her head for 9 days, the order of it, the evidence chain, which documents to present first, and which to hold until the foundational case was established. Her father had always said, "The record tells its own story if you arrange it correctly. Your job is not to argue. Your job is to arrange." She laid the copies out on the table in sequence, 7 territorial maps, 6 transaction records, the Blackthorn correspondence, the altered dates in the ledger. She had copied both the altered version and the original entry from the treaty register, side by side, in her own hand, with the discrepancy marked clearly in the margin. Harwick did not speak while she arranged them. He did not speak for a long time after she finished, either. He read each document with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. He went back to 2 of them twice. He set down the last document and looked at it for another moment without picking it up again. "You copied all of this yourself?" he said. "Yes." "The night before your exile?" "I had the copies before the exile," she said. "I made them as a precaution when I first understood what I had found. I did not know I would need them as soon as I did." He was quiet. "Why come here?" he said. "You could have run east, crossed into neutral territory, disappeared." "I could have," she said. "But the Border Council meets in 3 weeks. If Lord Vennick's representatives attend with authority over the northern territories, as they will if this evidence does not exist in the right hands before then, the Blackthorn transfers become legally retrospective. Whatever was sold becomes sold. That is not recoverable." She paused. "The King's Court was the correct destination. I came here because this is where the evidence belongs." Harwick looked at her for a long moment. "You'll remain here," he said finally. "You'll be given better accommodation and food. The Alpha King will determine how to proceed." He gathered the documents carefully and stood. "Don't attempt to leave the keep." "I have nowhere to go," she said simply. He paused at the door. "No," he said. "I imagine you don't." He left. She sat in the small, cold room for another hour. Then someone came to take her to a proper room, and she finally slept. He came himself. She had not expected that. She had expected another advisor, or perhaps a formal summons to a hearing chamber, or simply a message through Harwick about what would happen next. She had not expected to look up from the table where she was sitting 3 days later and find the Alpha King of the Northern Territories standing in the doorway of her small room with no ceremony and no announcement except his lead guard, a broad-shouldered man named Tor, who had the look of someone permanently prepared for things to go wrong, standing 2 steps behind him. Kaelin was taller than she had imagined. That was the first thing. The portraits she had seen, the pack records contained official likenesses of all ruling alphas, received with treaty updates, had not captured the way he occupied space. not loudly, not by force. He stood in her doorway, and the room simply recalibrated around him, the way a room does when something important has entered it, and the air understands before the people do. He looked at her. She stood. "Sit down," he said. His voice was low and even, not kind, not unkind, simply precise. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Tor remained by the door. Kaelin set Harwick's copy of her documents on the table between them, but did not open them. He looked at her for a moment. Then he asked his first question. "What is your name?" Not Coldwell. Not what she'd given the guard, or Harwick, or the other advisors who had come through in the 2 days prior. Her name. "Sera," she said. He nodded slightly. "How long did it take you to find this?" He indicated the documents without opening them. "The first discrepancy, perhaps 4 hours," she said. "The full pattern, once I knew what I was looking at, 2 more evenings. I verified everything before I copied it." He nodded again. Then his third question. "Why did you come here instead of running?" She had answered this for Harwick. She had given the correct and sensible answer. The border council, the legal timeline, the place where the evidence belonged, all of it true. She looked at Kaelin and gave him the other part, the part she had not told Harwick. "Because I wanted someone to know," she said. "Not just to have the evidence exist somewhere. I wanted a person to know what Vennick did, and what it cost, and that I did not deserve what he called me. I understand that is not a legal argument. I am telling you, because you asked." Kaelin looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression and settled. "You'll stay in the keep," he said. "You'll be given a room near the upper library. You have access to the library and the east courtyard. You don't leave the keep without my permission." He stood. "My archivist will speak with you tomorrow." "Am I a prisoner?" she asked. He paused. He looked at her, not as an assessment this time, but as something more direct. "You walked 9 days in winter," he said. "Whoever is willing to do that to put evidence in the right hands is not someone I intend to lock in a cell." He moved toward the door. "You're safer here than anywhere else right now. That is all." He left. Tor followed. The door closed. Sera sat at the table for a moment and looked at the empty doorway. Then she picked up the documents, sorted them back into their correct order, and began to plan what she would say to the archivist tomorrow. The upper library was the largest room she had ever been inside. She had grown up with the Ironmere records room, a long, low space with shelves on 3 walls and 2 windows that let in gray northern light. And she had loved it, with a particular love of someone who has found the one place in the world that makes sense to them. The upper library of the Alpha King's fortress was what that room might have dreamed of becoming. 3 floors of shelves, a gallery running the 2nd and 3rd levels, accessible by iron spiral stairs in both corners. Maps in flat drawers below the east windows. Treaty ledgers in numbered sequence on the north wall, going back 4 generations. The smell of old parchment and oak, and the particular dry cold of a room kept climate-stable by thick stone walls. She stood in the doorway the first morning and looked at it for a long moment before she went in. She had been given a small room 2 corridors away. Proper bed, fire, a window that looked onto the east courtyard. Better than she had expected. She had slept 12 hours the first night and woken feeling, for the first time in weeks, like herself. She spent the first 2 days simply familiarizing herself with the archive's organization. She was not yet authorized to work on the evidence formally. The archivist, Edric, was a meticulous and careful man who trusted no one on principle and required a full orientation before allowing anyone near the treaty ledgers. She did not object. She understood Edric. He was her father, 30 years older and significantly more suspicious. She found the pattern on the third day. She had not been looking for it. She had been reading the Northern Border Treaty history, background, context, understanding the framework her evidence would need to fit into, when she found the first Ironmere land transaction that predated her own records by 2 years. She pulled the ledger. She pulled the one before it. She went back through the drawer of maps below the east window until she found the relevant surveys. She spent 6 hours that day in the corner of the upper library with documents spread across a reading table and the growing, cold understanding that what she had found in the Ironmere records room was not the beginning of the problem. It was merely the piece she happened to stumble into. The pattern went back 11 years. 3 different record keepers, none of whom had seen more than their individual piece of it. 7 packs along the northern border, with small irregular discrepancies in their territorial ledgers. Nothing large enough to trigger a formal audit. Everything precisely calibrated to fall below the threshold of routine examination. Someone had been very careful for a very long time. She brought it to Harik that evening. Not the full analysis, she was not ready to present that yet, but a single page with 3 of the earlier transactions laid against each other, with the pattern marked clearly. Harwick looked at it for 30 seconds. Then he went to find the Alpha King. Kaelin asked to see her the following morning. He read her single page and then asked 3 questions, all of which were exactly the right questions, and she found herself answering them in more detail than she had prepared because the questions were good enough to warrant it. How long to build the complete chain? He asked at the end. With access to the full archive, 4 weeks, she said. Maybe 3 if I work quickly. He looked at her. Work quickly, he said. 3 weeks. Later, when she tried to describe those 3 weeks to herself, the routine of them, the particular texture of the days, what she kept returning to was not the evidence itself, but the quality of the silence. She had always worked in silence. The Ironmere records room had been quiet, in the way of a room no one bothered to visit. The upper library was quiet in a different way, occupied, purposeful, a silence produced by people who were doing serious things, and had agreed without speaking that noise would be an intrusion. Edric gave her the corner table by the north windows. He brought her documents without being asked when he understood what she was building. He corrected her twice in the first week. Small errors in her reading of an archaic land measure system that predated the current treaties, without commentary beyond the correction itself. She thanked him and adjusted her work. After that, he trusted her. She worked from 6th bell to 2nd bell past dark most days. Kaelin came on the 8th day. He came in the early afternoon with no announcement, sat at the table across from her work, and read the assembled evidence chain silently for 40 minutes, while she continued her own work at the end of the same table. When he finished, he asked 2 questions. She answered them. He made a mark on his own document and left. He came again on the 16th day. This time he stayed longer. He sat across from her, and she explained the evidence chain from the beginning, not because he asked for the full briefing, but because the questions he was asking would have led there eventually, and she preferred to give the structure directly. He listened without interrupting. He asked 4 questions, all of which she had to think about before answering, which meant they were the right kind. She noticed, on the 16th day, that he had a quality of attention that she had rarely encountered. Most powerful people listened to reports and heard the parts that confirmed what they already thought. Kalen listened for the parts he had not anticipated. When something surprised him, his face did not show it loudly. A slight stillness, a fractional pause. But he went back to that part and asked about it until he understood it. She found herself on the walk back to her room that evening, thinking about the third question he had asked, turning it over. It was a good question. She had not had a good question to think about in a long time. She did not examine this too carefully. She had more important things to think about, and the evidence chain was not finished, and she was sleeping in someone else's fortress on someone else's goodwill, and had been a traitor and an exile for less than a month. This was not the time to think about the quality of a man's questions. She worked. She went back to the archive the next morning. By the end of the third week, the evidence chain was complete. 17 years of border transactions mapped and cross-referenced, the full scope of Vennick's arrangement with the Blackthorn Pack, documented and provable. 11 packs affected, 43 miles of the King's northern border compromised. She set the final document down and sat for a moment in the corner of the upper library with her ink-stained hands in her lap, and let herself feel, briefly, what it had cost to get to this point. Then she organized everything into sequence and went to tell Harwick it was ready.
She was asleep when it happened. She woke to boots in the corridor, fast, urgent, more than 2 people, and a quality of sound in the fortress that was wrong. Not an alarm. Something quieter and more controlled than an alarm. The sound of people who knew what had happened and were already responding. She was dressed and at her door before the knock came. Tor stood in the corridor, stone-faced. "The archive," he said. She followed him. They had come in through the library's service entrance, a door used for deliveries, key-locked, which meant they had either a key or someone with access to one. They had targeted the corner table by the north windows with precision. 3 months of mapped evidence, the cross-reference transaction chain she had been building, the spatial analysis of the territorial discrepancies, the documents she had been using as working copies, had been swept from the table and taken. What remained had been deliberately damaged, not randomly, specifically. The pieces that would be hardest to reconstruct. She stood at the edge of the table and looked at what was left. Edric stood against the far wall, with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years protecting these records and had just watched something happen that he would not forgive. He said nothing. Neither did she. Kalen arrived 12 minutes after she did. He stood in the doorway of the archive room and took in the damage without speaking. Then he looked at Sera. "How much can you rebuild?" he said. "Most of it," she said. "The foundational chain is intact. Those documents were already secured in the formal evidence file. What they took was the working layer, the analysis, the spatial mapping. 2 weeks, maybe less. I remember most of it." He looked at the damaged table for another moment. "This was targeted," he said. Not a question. "Yes." He turned to Tor. He gave 3 instructions: quiet, specific, immediate, and Tor left. He turned to Harwick, who had arrived behind him, and gave 2 more. Then he came to stand beside her at the table and looked at the damage from her angle. "Someone told Ironmere you were here," she said. "They've known for at least 2 weeks, possibly from the beginning." "Yes," he said. "Someone inside," she said. "The fortress. The keep." "Yes." She looked at him. He was looking at the damaged table with an expression she could not fully read. Controlled, but underneath the control, something that was not calm. "I'm sorry," she said. "I brought this in with me." He turned to look at her. For a moment she could not identify what was in his expression. Then he said,
You walked 9 days to bring it here. The problem was already here. We simply have it visible now instead of hidden. He moved her to new rooms that evening. 2 corridors from his own quarters, 3 floors up, with a guard on her door through the night. The archive was locked, and its access list reduced to 4 names. She lay awake in her new room listening to the fortress settle around her, and thought about the fact that someone in this building had been watching her work for weeks and had chosen this moment to act. They had waited until the evidence chain was nearly complete. They had taken the most difficult pieces to rebuild. They were patient. They were precise. They had access. She had no idea who they were, and they knew exactly where she slept. She could not sleep. She had expected this. She had not slept properly since the archive attack, and tonight was no different. Her mind running through the evidence chain in loops, looking for what had been taken and how to rebuild it fastest. And underneath that, quieter, the unresolvable question of who in this fortress had decided she was enough of a problem to act against. She had been in her room since second bell. The candle on the table had burned 2/3 of the way down. The knock came very quietly. She was at the door before the second one. She opened it. Kaelin stood in the corridor, alone. No Tor, no guard. He was not in his formal clothes. Dark shirt, dark trousers, his hair not quite ordered. He looked at her and at the candlelight behind her and said, "You're awake." "I haven't been sleeping well," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "May I come in?" he said. Not a command, an actual question. She stepped back from the door. He sat in the chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed. The candle between them on the table gave the room a low amber quality, and outside the window the winter sky was dark and still. Neither of them spoke immediately. "Did you always work in the records?" he said finally. "From when I was 7, she said. "My father taught me." A pause. He said the records were the only honest account of anything. That what people said they did and what the records showed they did were different things, and the records were more trustworthy. "He was right," Kaelin said. She looked at him. "Did you always want this?" she asked. She meant the title, the fortress, the weight of it. She meant the evidence chains and the archive attacks and the spy inside his own walls. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, snow had begun again, visible as a faint movement against the dark. "My father died when I was 24, he said. "He had been preparing me for it since I was 12. I understood everything it required long before I had it." He paused. Understanding something and being ready for it are different. "Yes," she said. "What will you do," he said, "when this is over?" She had not thought past the hearing. She had kept herself very deliberately from thinking past it, because the shape of after was something she could not afford to anticipate. "I don't know," she said honestly. "The pack exile stands until it's formally overturned. I have no pack. I have nowhere to go back to, even if the exile were lifted." She paused. "I suppose I'll find out." He looked at her. Something in the silence was different from the other silences, the professional ones, the archive ones, the ones with documents between them. This one had no documents, no evidence, no strategic purpose. It was simply 2 people in a room at 2 a.m, with the candle burning down and the snow falling outside. She said, "Why did you come tonight?" He was quiet for a moment. "I saw your light under the door," he said. "I've been walking the corridors. I do that when I can't settle." He looked at the window. "I didn't plan it." She believed him. That was the thing about him that she had come to trust without quite deciding to. He did not say things he had not thought about. Which meant
When he said something plainly, it was plain. At some point, the candle burned very low, and he said goodnight, and she watched the door close behind him and sat in the dimming room for a while before she went to sleep. She woke in the morning to pale winter light through the window and lay still for a moment, feeling oddly rested, and when she reached up to pull the blanket higher, she felt it. A sensation at her left collarbone, faint and specific, like the memory of warmth. She pulled her collar aside. The mark was there, pale silver lines branching from a central point, like frost on glass, fine and delicate and unmistakable, barely visible against her pale skin in the morning light. She had heard of mate bond marks. She knew what they were, how they formed, what the law said about them, what they meant. She had read about them in the treaty ledgers. There were provisions for them in the old compact language, legal weight given to their presence in formal proceedings. She sat with her hand pressed against her collarbone for a long time. Then she pulled her collar up, pinned it closed with a copper pin from her wrist braid, and went to the archive. She did not tell him. Lord Vennick arrived on a Tuesday. She knew he was coming before she saw him. The formal summons had gone to Ironmere 2 weeks prior, and Harwick had told her to expect a delegation. She had not expected to feel it the way she did. The knowledge that the man who had branded her a traitor and put her on the road in winter was now inside the same walls she was. She watched from the upper gallery of the east courtyard as his party rode through the gates. 8 riders, Vennick at the center, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, a man who had spent 30 years being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He looked up at the courtyard walls with the particular ease of someone who had come here to win. She went back to the archive. She had 3 more documents to organize before the hearing. The formal hearing was held in the South Chamber, a long room with a high vaulted ceiling, 3 judges' chairs on a raised platform at the far end, the Alpha King's chair on a separate dais to the right. Sera sat at the petitioner's table on the left. Vennick sat with his advisors on the right. The first hour went well. She presented the evidence in the order she and Harwick had agreed, the foundational chain first, then the spatial analysis, then the Blackthorn correspondence. The judges examined each document. 2 of them, she had been warned about this, had Ironmere alliances going back 2 generations, border lords whose territories shared a boundary with Vennick's pack. They asked careful questions. She answered them. Then Vennick's lead advisor stood. The counter-presentation took 40 minutes. Vennick had prepared well. His story was polished. Sera as a disgruntled record-keeper who had been dismissed for incompetence, who had stolen pack funds, who had fabricated the evidence chain as a means of revenge and as proof of value to enemy interests who were paying her to discredit Ironmere. He had witnesses, 3 of them, pack members who testified to the theft, to her dismissal, to the rumors that had circulated about her before the exile. She watched the judges. The 2 with Ironmere alliances were leaning forward. The third, an older man from the Western packs with no Ironmere connection, was looking at his hands. She was careful. She was precise. She did not show anything on her face that she did not mean to show. But she understood, watching the room, that the evidence was correct, and the evidence might not be enough. Vennick stood last. He addressed the judges in the formal manner, voice measured and authoritative, and when he finished, he turned to his advisor, who produced a document sealed with Ironmere's official wax. "My lords," Vennick said, "I have withheld this until now in hope of avoiding its necessity. This is a secondary exile order, executed under pack law, charging Sera Coldwell not merely with treason, but with the voluntary severance of her pack bonds through the use of prohibited bone rights. Under the provisions of the Compact of Martin's Field, a wolf who voluntarily severs pack bonds surrenders all legal standing before any court. No petition rights, no testimony rights, no right of address." He paused.
Miss Coldwell's presence at this hearing is therefore without legal foundation. Her evidence cannot be admitted. Her testimony cannot be heard. The chamber was very quiet. She heard the judges confer in low voices. She looked at the document from across the room, the seal, the formal language, Vennick's signature. She could see from here that it was properly executed. She had read enough legal documents in her life to know what a properly executed one looked like. The senior judge spoke. Under the provisions cited, the petitioner's testimony and evidence are suspended pending review of the severance order. He looked at Sera. The petitioner will withdraw from the hearing floor. She stood. She walked out of the south chamber with her back straight and her face still. The door closed behind her. She stood in the stone corridor alone, no guard, Harwick still inside, and looked at the wall opposite and allowed herself, for the span of perhaps 20 seconds, to understand what had just happened. 3 months, 9 days in the snow. The archive, the evidence chain rebuilt after the attack, all of it. The corridor was very quiet. She heard the door open behind her. She did not turn immediately. She thought it was Harwick coming to tell her what she already knew, what the next steps would be, what legal recourse remained, how long the review would take, and what it was likely to find. She was calculating it herself, standing against the wall. A bond severance review took a minimum of 60 days under the compact. The Border Council met in 11 days. The window was already closed. Sera. She turned. Kaelin stood in the corridor. He had come out of the hearing himself, left the chamber, left the judges and Vennick, and the formal proceedings, and was standing 10 feet from her in the stone corridor, alone. No Tor, no advisor. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read in the low torchlight. The review will take 60 days minimum, she said. Her voice was even. The Border Council meets in 11. Whatever Vennick's representatives present there. I know, he said. The evidence is correct. It was always correct. He found a mechanism that doesn't depend on the evidence being Sera. She stopped. He took 2 steps toward her, not the careful distance he usually kept, the professional, appropriate space of a hearing chamber and an archive, and a corridor where things were being handled formally. He stopped close enough that she could see the pale silver rings in his dark gray eyes in the torchlight. Show me, he said. She looked at him. What? The mark. I know it's there. I have known for 8 days. I felt it the morning after I came to your room. Something shifted that I have been trying to explain as something else for a week, and I cannot explain it as something else anymore. His voice was very even. Show me. She did not move for a long time. This was not how she had imagined telling him. In a cold stone corridor, after a hearing that had just destroyed 3 months of work, with the sound of Vennick's voice still in the air. She had not, truthfully, been planning to tell him at all. She had been keeping the mark behind pinned collars and careful angles, and the pragmatic reasoning that the hearing had to come first, and this was not the time. It was apparently the time, regardless. She reached up and unpinned the collar. She folded it aside. The mark glowed. Not the pale, dormant silver she had seen in her mirror every morning for 8 days. Fully lit, warm and alive, the branching lines luminous in the torchlight. The warmth of it, visible even through the linen of her dress, in the space immediately around the mark. In his presence, at this distance, it was not subtle. Kaelin looked at it. She watched him look at it. He was very still. The expression on his face was the expression she had seen in the archive on the 16th day, when she had said something that surprised him.
That particular quality of stillness that meant he was reevaluating something at a level below the surface. He looked up at her. She held his gaze and said nothing, and waited. He looked at the mark one more time. Then he straightened. Something settled in his face. Not a decision made, but a decision that had been made before this moment, and was now simply being acknowledged. "Wait here," he said. He turned. He went back to the door of the south chamber. He opened it and went inside. She stood in the corridor and pressed her hand against the mark, which went on glowing regardless, and waited. She heard the chamber go quiet. Through the closed door, the thick oak of it, the stone walls, she could hear the shape of what was happening without the words. A voice that was Kaelin's. A pause. Another voice, one of the judges, rising in something between surprise and objection. Kaelin's voice again, level and absolute. A longer silence. Then nothing. Then footsteps that were not leaving. The door opened. Harwick appeared first, his expression carefully blank in the way of someone who has just witnessed something significant and has not yet had time to decide what he thinks about it. He looked at Sera and said nothing. Behind him, Vennick's advisors filed out. And Vennick himself, whose face was arranged in the smooth, controlled manner of a man who has just lost something and is not ready to show it. He glanced at her as he passed, just briefly. She held his gaze and watched him look away first. Kaelin was the last one through the door. He pulled it closed behind him and stood in the corridor. They were alone. She looked at him. "What did you do?" she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "The Alpha King's right to claim," he said. "Pre-compact provision. It predates the severance law by 60 years. A claimed mate cannot be exiled. Pack bonds under a mate bond are not severed. They're transferred to the king's own pack. The second exile order is void." She processed this, the legal architecture of it, the specificity of the provision he had used, the fact that it had to have been in his mind before he walked out of the hearing. He had known the provision. He had come into the corridor already holding it. "The Border Council," she began. "The evidence will be presented at the Border Council," he said. "The Ironmere case will be heard before the full court before the month is out. The spy in my keep will be found." The evidence was always correct. We have cleared the mechanism he used to bury it. She looked at him. He had done this in a hearing room, in front of 3 judges and Vennick's full delegation. He had invoked a pre-compact provision that named her as his claimed mate in front of witnesses, for the record, with legal standing. "You understand what you just—" she began. "Yes," he said. She was quiet. "Why?" she said. It was the same question she had asked him once before, in a different form, in a different room, and gotten the careful answer, the strategic answer. She was asking again, for the other part. He looked at her. The torchlight was the same as it had been, the same corridor, the same stone walls, but something had changed in the quality of the distance between them. "Because the evidence was right," he said. "Because you walked 9 days in the snow to get it here. Because you rebuilt the evidence chain after someone destroyed it without being asked and without complaint. Because you came into a room alone with me and told me the truth, when the easy answer was the strategic one." He paused. "And because—" He stopped. Something in his face, a fraction of the careful control, opened slightly. "I needed a reason the law would understand," he said finally. She looked at him. She knew there was more he had not said. The part that was behind the legal provision and the correct evidence and the 9 days in the snow. The part that had been in the archive on the 16th day and in her room at 2 in the morning and in the corridor just now when he had looked at the mark and gone very still before he went back through the door. She knew. He knew she knew. Neither of them said it. Not yet. The hearing was over, and the spy was still in the walls, and the Border Council was in 11 days, and there was still too much to do, and too much that was uncertain, and too much that had happened in too short a time to say the rest of it plainly. But she did not move back from the distance between them, and neither did he. "I suppose," she said finally, very quietly, "I should go back to the archive." "Yes," he said. The corner of his mouth moved, barely, the smallest thing. "I'll come in the afternoon." She nodded. She walked back down the corridor toward the library stairs. At the first turning, she paused and looked back. He was still standing where she had left him. He was watching her go. She turned the corner. The mark burned warm and steady at her collarbone, in the dark of her dress, in the cold corridor. No longer something she was managing or hiding or explaining to herself. Just there. Present and certain, and entirely unwilling to pretend otherwise anymore.